It is my pleasure to introduce Lucia Pietropaoli, who is the team leader for ASEAN-Australia's counter-trafficking program. She is going to be our keynote speaker this morning, and she is a recognized expert in human rights with a particular focus on human trafficking issues in the ASEAN region. She's dedicated her career to fostering collaboration, sustainable business, across Southeast Asia, and focuses on engaging stakeholders. And what you're going to hear today is a deep dive into the very challenging issue of human trafficking. As social compliance auditors, it's something that we have to keep in mind every day. And in fact, it is a requirement that if you're going to do an audit under APSCA auspices, to include forced labor as something that you must check on in order to do a competent social compliance audit. So with that, let me introduce Lucia Pietropaoli and enjoy the session.
Thank you so much, Ross, and thank you to APSCA and to the organisers of this conference. It is an honour and a privilege to be able to address all of you. I am one of those outsiders that Ross mentioned in his opening session, and as an outsider, my day looks very different to yours. I spend a lot of time in government meetings, in ASEAN regional meetings, talking about the laws and the policy frameworks on issues like human trafficking, forced labour, modern slavery as it's referred to in some countries, migration and labour policy. And I have to confess myself, it wasn't until July last year, so very late in the piece, when I met SEDEX at a modern slavery conference in Australia. And I realised then that there was such a critical role played by social audit in countering trafficking and countering forced labour. It was remiss of me, and I think it's actually remiss of our sector, spending most of our time with government, with NGOs that are supporting victims, with private sector companies, but completely ignoring to date the really critical role that you play in minimising labour abuse and exploitation. And of course, as we all know, the best way to address forced labour is for it not to happen at all. And so you guys play a really important preventative role. But of course, we don't live in an ideal world. We're all trying to look for the way the world should be, but unfortunately, we need to look at the way the world is. The way the world is, including in this region, does still include labour exploitation and abuse. And so in today's presentation, I'm going to go through some of those political economy factors or some of those structural factors that underpin labour abuse and exploitation. The first part of the presentation may be a little bit grim. And so of course, I also want to offer some good practices, some hope, and what will hopefully propel us forward as we navigate the future of social audit, and we really continue to foster these multi-sectoral partnerships for better business and human rights and for countering issues like forced labour. So firstly, just to give you a very brief introduction to who we are, the ASEAN-Australia Counter-Trafficking Program. We're funded by the Australian Government through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We are entirely overseas development assistance, and our goal really is to support ASEAN as a region and all ASEAN member states to implement their obligations around counter-trafficking and forced labour. ASEAN actually has an incredibly progressive instrument called the ASEAN Convention on Trafficking in Persons. It's legally binding. It applies to all 10 members, including Vietnam, where we are right here. But of course, as we all know, what's written on paper, what's been agreed to at the political level is very difficult to implement. There are varying degrees of capacity across this region and other regions. There are varying degrees of political will. There are large inequalities between countries, and this, of course, has a huge impact on their abilities to prevent and address forced labour. So why should auditors and counter-trafficking actors connect? And this, of course, is how I opened and admitted and confessed, really, that I don't think we have connected meaningfully enough as yet. A lot of counter-trafficking actors are law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, social workers, NGOs, and they're very far removed from the world of business, from the world of audit and the work that all of you do in preventing and responding to labour issues. So I think we all know that global supply chains are growing in their complexity and they're growing in their scale. And this, of course, requires a more complex approach and a complex response. We need to bring in a broader range of actors, and I was very encouraged by the framing of this conference talking about multi-sectoral collaboration and a diverse range of actors to build an evidence base, to really get a picture of what's going on and then to help us formulate our responses. We know and we've seen, I know you all spoke in detail about the CSDDD yesterday, but there are really encouraging shifts in certain jurisdictions around the world towards better human rights due diligence. That of course includes the EU, the UK and Australia and Canada already have their modern slavery acts, Germany has its Supply Chains Act, Japan has voluntary human rights due diligence. So we know that our markets are becoming more advanced and realising that it's not just about the bottom line. Counter-trafficking actors themselves, in the sector where I spend most of my time, are moving beyond criminal justice responses to counter-trafficking towards whole of society responses. So we know, according to the Global Slavery Index, there are around 50 million people in conditions of modern slavery around the world. When we look at the number of trafficking cases coming through the justice system, they're in the hundreds. So in Thailand, for example, around 200 cases. In Vietnam, around 150 cases per year. So that shows us that the scale of the problem and the scale of the solution are completely mismatched at the moment. Meaning that we need to look for better access to justice and remedies for workers that go beyond the criminal justice system. Not saying that criminal justice doesn't have an important role, and when a crime like trafficking in persons occurs, it should be addressed. But there is a whole spectrum of labour abuse and exploitation, and I know that many of you play a role in looking at that spectrum before it gets to the pointy end. And this brings me to my next slide, which many of you will be familiar with, but really just to demonstrate that we're all existing and working and trying to make interventions somewhere around this spectrum. So those at the green end, of course, where you've got tick, 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 you've got all greens, you've got a great report on your clipboard, there is nothing to see or worry about here. You've got decent working conditions, free working conditions. In this region, we do have significant amounts of workers experiencing labour abuse and exploitation. And at the pointy end, we of course have a situation of forced labour, we have human rights abuses and labour abuses, and we can have severe exploitation and human trafficking. Human trafficking can be highly organised, it can be linked to other forms of transnational organised crime. So at that red end of the spectrum, we really do have quite serious organised crime occurring. But often, workers may start out in a situation in the green, and it's a progressive scale. And so your audits and your interventions at the early end can prevent situations from becoming more pointy end. And this, I guess, is part of the collaboration and the importance of using audit as a prevention and also a mechanism for responding. To talk very briefly about human trafficking, and I definitely do not want to get into a legal debate about what it is and what it's not. It's a really difficult concept for people to visualise, even though it has been criminalised in international law through the UN Protocol on Transnational Organised Crime for a really long time. And most countries in the world have criminalised trafficking in persons, including every country in this region. It is still very difficult to prove, and it's very difficult to conceptualise. Some forms of trafficking, when people think about trafficking, they normally think about sex trafficking. They might think about women and children being abused, either whether that's online or offline. By and large, labour trafficking and forced labour is still very under-acknowledged as a form of trafficking. So trafficking, according to the UN definition, the international definition, has three different elements. Essentially, acts, means and purpose. The act being the recruitment, the gathering, the advertising of a job, the agreement of a worker to engage in that kind of job. It doesn't have to be agreement. It may also be that workers are taken. They may also be drugged and find themselves in a job that they haven't consented to. So the act of recruiting somebody into exploitative work, the means, and this is where it gets tricky to prove, because often the means involves coercion and deception. It's much easier to prove when someone has been physically coerced, where there was violence involved, where they are detained, where they don't have their freedom of movement. Much more difficult to prove when there's been an abusive position of vulnerability, for example. There may be a romantic relationship between a trafficker and the trafficked person. So all these different kinds of abuses of power take place to then result in the exploitation. So the forms of exploitation that are recognised under the Trafficking Protocol include slavery, sexual exploitation, servitude, removal of organs, and of course forced labour, the issue that we're going to hone in on today. It's really important to recognise that if a worker signs a contract, they can still be a victim of trafficking. So even if a worker has consented, it doesn't mean they can't be abused and exploited. Also important to recognise that there doesn't need to be a physical movement of one person transported from country X to country Y. Trafficking can take place entirely online. Trafficking can also take place within borders. So it's a very, very complex legal concept. I think for this purpose and for this audience, none of us are judges, none of us are police or prosecutors. We don't need to be making the legal determination about whether it's trafficking or not. But I think what's really important is to look at some of those early indicators of what might be a forced labour or trafficking situation, because this is where all of us do have a role to play in referring, in looking a little deeper. As I said to Ross just before, Australia has an anti-trafficking training program which is called Look a Little Deeper, and I think it's such a good phrase to actually see what is going on beyond the surface. So these, of course, many of you will have seen these before, the ILO indicators of forced labour. There is not a set number around how many of these equate to forced labour, and obviously these can occur to varying degrees as well. So forced labour is much more difficult to criminalise and put into law than trafficking in persons. But effectively, these indicators, when combined in certain combinations, are indicators of forced labour. Forced labour can be prosecuted using your trafficking legislation in many countries around the world. It can be prosecuted using modern slavery related offences in criminal codes and penal codes, but it can also be addressed through remedies and through access to justice or other remedial services by companies and by workers themselves. So all of you will have seen these indicators, I'm sure, and just on the it's my right, it's probably your left, you can see the degrees to which these occur. This is just a global assessment by the ILO. Again, I think some of these are very obvious and others of them are harder to prove. Some countries around the world, or some states, in Victoria example, where I'm from, they've actually criminalised wage theft. So it is really important to understand the legal jurisdictions in which you're operating, because we're all operating in such different jurisdictions. It's impossible to generalise, but in some countries we do actually have legal provisions to prosecute against some of these violations of forced labour. Just to give you a quick overview of some of the stats in the region that we are in at the moment. I know we have a global audience, but given that we are in Vietnam and given that it is such a growing market, as Ross mentioned at the start, just honing in a little bit on some of the statistics, but also highlighting that statistics and data around trafficking and forced labour is very difficult to obtain. It is only ever an estimate, and it's very likely an underestimate, and you would all know that as well. Workers are very unlikely to report worker abuse and violations. There are all different ways in which these can be covered up. But in general, we see 15.1 million estimated to be in a situation of forced labour in the Asia Pacific on any given day. That is more than half of the 26.7 global estimate. So just to show you that this region has a problem with forced labour. It also has a lot of opportunity. It also has a lot of investment. It has a lot of growth. And so really just to make the case for do read up, engage, be in this region. This is a really important part of global supply chains. And then on the other side there, just to look at the profits, 62% Trafficking for forced labour follows patterns of migration into labour-intensive sectors in this region. So we do see that migrant workers are particularly vulnerable to forced labour in Southeast Asia. This, of course, relates to inequalities and socio-economic disparities, demographic factors, and weak rule of law and weak governance across the region. Typically, we have countries of origin and countries of destination in this region, with countries of origin including Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, although that's changing, and countries of destination being countries, the larger economies, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. We have, of course, seen that be flipped on its head recently with trafficking into online scamming, and many of you might have seen the reports and heard about the huge cost to people in the economy of online scamming, but that's for a whole nother keynote. But just to note that the big economies in this region, Thailand and Malaysia, are the key destinations of exploitation. Singapore, of course, is a good destination for migrant labour, but is also much better regulated. Some of the key industries: agriculture, fishing, construction, manufacturing, and domestic work. Trafficking for forced marriage is a concern, and I guess as auditors you're also discovering all sorts of issues in workplaces, not just working conditions. So it is important to know that there are large patterns of movement from Vietnam, Cambodia, from Thailand even, and from Myanmar for forced marriage into China particularly. New patterns of trafficking have emerged into online scamming, particularly associated with special economic zones in the region. So this iceberg basically is the look a little deeper, and it's really to have a bit of an illustration of some of the things that we don't see. So in my sphere, you know, I see victims, survivors of trafficking, forced labour, I see perpetrators, offenders, I see anti-slavery responses, I see large amounts of donor investments, whether it's by the EU or the US or Australia, in these problems. We see labour abuses and exploitation, and that's what you guys see as auditors. What you don't see below the surface is some of the unspoken rules, the informal processes, the gendered power imbalances, corruption, although sometimes you might see corruption more openly as well. You might see, you may not see unwritten incentives and interests, both of employers and of regulators and of officials. We also see in this region there's a strong prioritisation of economic growth over good governance. So we tend to see in this part of the world that the governance challenges are like human rights challenges, civil society, openness, a free and independent press, lag behind the priority of economic growth. And that's why human rights and due diligence is particularly challenging in this region. We also see rule by law rather than the law actually ruling to protect the society. So regularly legal systems are used to protect the interests of the powerful. I just got the 10-minute warning already, so this has really flown. I think I'm going to need to skip through some slides. just to introduce that the next bit of content is based on some research that our program has done with ODI, and we have looked at the structural vulnerabilities to labour exploitation, particularly of migrant workers. We've taken a cyclical approach, so we've looked not just at the destination or the area where they are working, but we've also looked at the vulnerabilities on their pre-departure, during recruitment, also during their return and reintegration. Because there is a high likelihood, if someone is not effectively reintegrated and supported, they'll be re-trafficked. So we've looked at this across the cycle, and we've identified some very common, across this region, vulnerabilities that individual workers face to forced labour. This relates to long-standing social inequalities and discrimination. In this region, we know that we have many ethnic minorities, many religious minorities, gender imbalances. These are not protected with anti-discrimination legislation, and even if there is legislation in place, it's rarely enforced. We also have significant abuses of power. So there's a quite strong fusion between political interests and business interests in this region. Large proportions of industry are state-owned enterprises, meaning that a lot of scrutiny, a lot of regulation, a lot of legal standards that might apply to regular industries don't apply to these particular businesses. There is a lack of awareness of the social protections that are available to migrants. So in a country like Thailand, migrants actually do have quite good access to social protection, to health, to education, not to legal identity if they're stateless, but that's a separate issue. But even if they do have access to these protections, they're often not aware of them. And if they are undocumented or if they are irregular workers, they're very unlikely to want to come forward to claim any benefits for fear of being criminalised or stigmatised for being an irregular worker. There's a lack of linguistic and cultural familiarity of migrant workers. So there's a lot of linguistic diversity across this region, and we see in many workplaces they're composed of people from all different kinds of minority linguistic or ethnic backgrounds. When it comes to support, to remedies, to unions, to workers' organisations, they're only often available to nationals of that country. So there's a disconnect between the composition of the workplace and the actual services that are provided in a form, in a language, in a way that they can access. We also see regularly that employers, unfortunately, are confiscating documents and assets of employees. Wage theft by employers is a common practice, and we have a study particularly on wage theft and how that actually increased during COVID-19 with little scrutiny and little ability for workers to reclaim any lost wages. I talked a little bit about debt. A lot of migrant workers do take on significant debt to migrate and work in a destination country. Sometimes when they arrive in that destination country, that debt will be inflated, it'll be removed from their wages gradually, and they find themselves in a situation of debt bondage. So looking not just at the work conditions in the workplace, but also the recruitment processes and whether those were clear and transparent, what the costs were for migrants, is an important part of understanding the migrants' overall well-being and situation. People with disabilities have intersecting and often unrecognised vulnerabilities. We have another study on trafficking in persons and the nexus with persons with disabilities. It's a fascinating area that is often not acknowledged. I think it's fair to say that our workplaces are not inclusive enough to accommodate persons with disabilities. That makes them particularly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. On the converse side, we often have victims of forced labour acquire a disability. If they've been on a fishing vessel, if they've been at a construction site, if they're not effectively supported and reintegrated, that impairment becomes a permanent disability that then creates ongoing stigma and issues for them in being able to contribute meaningfully. Irregular workers we do need to make the point that in this region, most people travel informally, not formally. And I know that this region is not unique. You know, many of you are from America, where you also have a large proportion of undocumented migrant workers. So undocumented migrant workers are particularly vulnerable. They don't want to have contact with officials. They avoid officialdom. They avoid any kind of process that might expose them. So as auditors, of course, we really need to take that into account and be very sensitive in the way that we are talking to workers, thinking about how we can support them, making sure that there is a relationship of trust, and that we're actually not going to make them more vulnerable or more at threat by talking and engaging. I'm going to skip through this slide because I think that you all know there are sectors of concern, but also need to make the point that any sector can be vulnerable to forced labour or trafficking in persons. Some of the responses to date, I know that you would be familiar with some of the private sector responses, but really just want to highlight the critical role of civil society as well. In many parts of this region, workers are not allowed to start unions if they're migrant workers, or unionisation is highly restricted and highly scrutinised. So it is really important to look at the role that non-government organisations provide in raising awareness about rights and protections for workers, in also helping workers access remedies and justice if there is a dispute or something has gone wrong in their workplace. They also do a lot of advocacy to government for better policy, and part of our program is actually providing grants to NGOs to support not their service delivery but more the policy and advocacy that they can do to governments in this region to make laws, policies and practices more worker friendly and more inclusive, particularly of migrant worker populations. I want to focus quickly on this slide, really just to show that your function is so important, and I think it's really, I liked the word that I think it was Barbara mentioned, an ecosystem. And we do all operate in an ecosystem, even though it's really difficult sometimes to look above our desks and our silos and to overcome the institutional barriers that exist and the sectoral barriers that exist. But of course, audits, I think, work best when they're combined with other tools and approaches. And this can include, of course, ongoing monitoring and employee feedback. We can complement audits with other tools such as risk assessment, workers' voice grievance mechanisms and supply chains mapping, which a lot of big companies, for example in Australia, because they have their modern slavery obligations, they're doing this anyway. So there is a lot of other information to draw on as well. The downstream partners. So we all know that it's very difficult to actually impose on a small and medium enterprise or a micro enterprise a very rigorous due diligence or audit process. But I think it's really critical to look beyond a parent company or to look beyond a large company and to encourage audits. Maybe they're modified, maybe they're minimised, maybe they're made more accessible, but those smaller firms and subcontractors also need to be very aware and accountable for good labour practices, and then we get the transparency throughout the supply chain. I think transparent reporting of audit results can drive positive change, and I'm very interested in your views as a membership-based peak body on how we can encourage greater transparency across the sector. I know that sometimes, big companies will say their audits are commercial in confidence and that a lot of the assessments that are produced for large companies never go beyond those company walls. But really, we do get innovation, we do get reform or improvement when information is transparent and there's sector-wide change, not just change of an individual company. I'm going to skip through this to go to the best practices because I have 2 minutes left. That went incredibly quickly. Just to highlight 2 best practices before I finish up. So I think some of you will be aware of the innovations happening in social audits, and the Million Makers is a worker-based or worker-inclusive social audit tool that some of you might have been familiar with. There's a lot of information on it online, but the key to this social audit model is that workers are central to it. And the other key to this worker-centred model is that they actually participate and get compensation for their data. So just highlighting a very brief case study there of an agribusiness in India that used the Million Makers tool to cross-check a SMETA audit. And in this process, workers provided direct worker data. It's anonymous, which of course is really important. 100% of workers participated in this factory in gathering data, which is quite a remarkable statistic. And they generated a whole lot of data of which they got paid for that particular data, but they also get paid every time their data is used. So I really like this model for a range of reasons. It's inclusive, it gives you deeper insights, and it actually provides fair and appropriate compensation for the workers that participate. And just finally, a quick example of a really good NGO initiative from Thailand. So this application is called Masked Human. It was developed through a collaboration with a UN agency, an NGO, and a private sector benefactor, a private sector investment. It's for workers at sea, and we all know that fishing, particularly deep sea fishing, continues to be a really, really difficult sector to regulate. This is an application that's available in 4 different languages for workers at sea. It has an educative function of providing access to information, rights and protection. It has a direct link into the Ministry of Labour in Thailand, where a worker can lodge a labour complaint, which is then connected into a government system and is followed up on. It also has an alert system, an emergency system, which goes straight in to law enforcement, so actual official crimes can be reported through this application as well. It also has some really good geospatial tracking features to it, so you can monitor where workers are. This is just one example, I think, of NGOs having direct access to large groups of workers, and with some support, they need financial support, they may need some technical assistance, they can actually develop a technical solution which provides a real-time and responsive application for workers who are experiencing abuse or exploitation in the fishing sector, or who just want to know about their rights and protections. Just very quickly to talk about some of the concerns that keep me up at night. One of them is, in some of our countries, shrinking civic space, particularly for journalists, for civil society. It's really, really important that we have a commitment to free and open, incredible information, particularly when it comes to human rights abuses. AI changing the nature of work, and I'm sure this will be something that might come up throughout your next day and a half. It could be really great for eliminating some of those dirty, degrading and dangerous jobs. Equally, it could render a whole lot of people jobless and make them more vulnerable to other forms of abuse and exploitation. Economic shocks reinforce a bottom line mentality, and we saw this exact thing during COVID. We've talked about building back better. I think we've done some things better, but of course we know that the world is vulnerable to other kinds of shocks, and we need to put ourselves in a situation where business and human rights is not a nice to do, it's a must do. Lack of political prioritisation of the issue. I mean, I know I'm speaking to the converted here, but the more you do have the opportunity to speak to lawmakers, to speak to politicians, to advocate as a peak body, there is still not enough attention on this issue. I would say when it comes to the environment, it's a must-have. Like, we've reached the tipping point, although we know that things like financing is very difficult still. But when it comes to labour standards, I still don't think we have that critical mass of political support. I still don't think consumers are aware that if something is costing $2, it's too cheap. There must be exploitation in that supply chain. So continue to build the coalition, continue to expand the range of people that need to know about this issue. My final slide, what will propel us forward? Because we are talking about the future as the theme of this conference. Legislative and policy reforms. We know that the private sector will only comply if it is actually a requirement. So we do need those right enabling laws in place. We do have some really positive signs. Even Thailand is now developing a human rights due diligence law, which is the first in Southeast Asia. It also requires all its listed companies to now do an ESG report for the Thailand Stock Exchange. Australia just last week announced a new anti-slavery commissioner who has a very strong mandate to help us enforce our modern slavery provisions in the Penal Code as well as our Modern Slavery Act. Global markets are demanding higher standards. Trade agreements. I think this is something that can be really explored. I know you're not trade negotiators, but our trade negotiators really need to, in the more advanced markets, be using those mechanisms strongly to enforce better labour standards from the outset. Technology can provide us an incredible resource to access massive amounts of big data, also to engage workers in different ways. And fundamentally, this seems obvious, but I think we need to focus on inclusive, healthy and productive workplaces. I talk about trafficking in persons all the time and people say, oh, that's a bit negative. Can't you just come up with something positive? This is my argument, this is my way of phrasing essentially what we're after as the long-term goal. Inclusive, healthy, productive workplaces, and where those standards are seen as better business and good business practice, not as a nice to do. And finally, my final point, particularly for this region, we need improved migration governance and migrant worker protection. People are on the move for all sorts of reasons in this particular global climate that we're facing. Migrant workers are fundamental to our economies, yet we don't acknowledge and protect them with the same set of rights as nationals. So let's really try to work on policymakers, on decision makers for better labour migration governance as well. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a real privilege and I'm looking forward to talking to you in the break. Thank you.